Today's video is brought to you by Loot Anime, the monthly subscription service for epic anime gear. You can learn more about Loot Anime at the end of this video. Not too long ago, Nintendo had its final Super Smash Bros. Nintendo Direct presentation. As usual, the hype train for more Nintendo information roared on, with hundreds of thousands of watchers glued to their screens over multiple different streaming platforms. As long as video games exist, gamers will seek out any information that they can find for upcoming games. It's one of the few things in life I've seen where consumers get so excited to watch a commercial. But today, I want to focus on one of the first video game hype machines I've ever heard about. Space World, a Nintendo exclusive trade show used to share information about their upcoming games and consoles. Yes, it was literally just called Space World. Because it's like, games of the future? I don't know, man. We'll be covering three of the biggest Space World hardware reveals. The 1995 unveiling of the Nintendo 64, the 1996 N64 show, which pushed the new 64DD, and the 2000 Nintendo GameCube show. We'll be looking at the way these consoles were revealed, and of course, the many different ways that pre-launch games ended up completely different from the reveal to their eventual release. There's just too much info here for just one video, so today we're going to look at the Nintendo 64. Or perhaps I should say, the Ultra 64. Let's take a ride in the time machine back to 1995. 1995 wasn't just a huge year for the Nintendo Space World show, it was also the very first installment of a hype machine that you'll still hear about today, E3. The spring of 95 was a strange time for Nintendo. Despite dominating the console market for a decade, Sega had finally given Nintendo solid market competition with the Genesis. And while Nintendo did find a new burst of life with its Super Nintendo sales in Donkey Kong Country, their message was clear. Consumers wanted bigger games, 3D games, and a new games console to run them on. Sega announced that their new 32-bit Sega Saturn console would be available today, the same day as their E3 press conference. That kinda backfired. Meanwhile, Sony unveiled that their PlayStation console would be hitting the West in September, for $100 less than the Saturn. They're a big fan of that tactic, huh?
I'm very proud to announce that PlayStation 4 will be available at $399.
A battle for the two next big consoles had begun in the West, but meanwhile, all Nintendo could do was quietly announce that their new console, the Ultra 64, would be delayed into the next year. The only thing Nintendo brought to E3 was their new semi-portable console, the Virtual Boy. I'm gonna leave this bad boy out of today's conversation for a future video, but needless to say, it wasn't the strongest first E3 for Nintendo. It wasn't until the winter, by the time that the Sony PlayStation was in stores, that Nintendo could even reveal a tech demo for their upcoming hardware. In late November 1995, the Space World show in Shoshinkai, Japan would finally unveil the plans for the Nintendo 64. It was at this time that the previous Ultra 64 title was dropped, likely due to a trademark dispute on the word Ultra with Konami. Of course it was Konami. There isn't a ton of free footage taken from the 1995 show, but you know who was delivering this year? The UK. They had not one, but two competing television shows that were both around to cover the Nintendo 64 unveiling. Channel 4's Gamesmaster and ITV's Bad Influence. Video files on the internet were rare and usually very small, so I'm glad that these television programs were saved through fans and VHS tapes to preserve them for the future. In total, there were only 2 playable titles to demo with the system, and while it was clear that Nintendo was behind schedule, the console, its controller, and its functionality were very close to what would eventually become the final product. Perhaps my favorite reaction to the hardware are people trying to make sense of the N64's wacky controller. Reactions weren't necessarily as negative as they are today in retrospect. After all, the N64 was one of the first major console controllers to utilize the analog stick. But you can already tell that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the way to combine the new stick with the classic D-pad at the same time. I also love hearing some of the mixed reactions to the new memory cards that would be directly compatible with the controllers.
This is a new kind of memory card, and it plugs in there. The card can store customized game or controller settings, and you'll be able to save information on an individual's style of gameplay. So in theory, you'll be able to play against your friends even when they're not there. At least we think that's it. Our instruction book had been translated directly from the Japanese.
Well, no, that's not really how it works. Although I guess that does kind of describe how the Smash Amiibo would function 20 years later. The real meat of these Space World exhibits comes from the games, however, so let's take a look at some of the early N64 games as they were shown in 1995. The main game, without a doubt, that was on display during this show was Super Mario 64, which was reported to be about 50% complete at the time. The version that the public first saw was definitely a little different than what you might know today. You can make out pieces of things that still exist from the originals, like the stretchable face, Peach's castle, and Cool Mountain, but there are some things that just feel off at every corner. The interface and damage meter at the top of the screen is definitely still in prototype, as well as the stars themselves, which look really flat and out of place when compared to the final product. Also off is Mario's voice. Charles Martinet's vocals have yet to be selected for this game, leaving us with this maniac.
Super Mario 64.
Ew. Boy, am I glad they ended up putting this man to work. Speaking of creepy changes, a few of the enemies and NPCs had some changes as well. The Thwomps appear slightly different, still just as miserable, but with much larger eyes. And the parent penguin just looks so much more depressed than the final design that they ended up using. Another change that I'm okay with. I'm not going to get too deep with each and every change that was made for all of these games, since this is a comprehensive look at everything Space World had to offer, versus one of those full beta dissections, but it is interesting to see some of the elements that ended up changing. Aside from these though, you can really see in the demo footage that many of the game's courses were already complete at the time of display. I really do get a kick out of how the press was so impressed by graphics though.
One of its most striking graphical effects is the ability to take objects, polygon objects, close to the player without them becoming pixelated and blocky, as many players will be familiar with on other platforms.
And yes, you are watching the game screen. Amazingly, this is not a rendered graphics demo. It's what you get when you play the game.
What a time the 90s were. Hey guys, in case you were wondering, this isn't a cutscene. These are real in-game graphics. It turns out that the polygon did not end up aging that well over the next few decades, but I guess at the time, it was pretty revolutionary. The only other playable demo at the time was Kirby Bowl 64. Yeah, can't find that cart for the N64 these days, because it was never released. Gameplay appeared to be a mix between a Marble Madness style roller, similar to what we'd eventually see in games like Kirby Tilt and Tumble, as well as a board racer, similar to what we'd eventually get in Kirby Air Ride. Both modes aim to make the most usage of the N64's precision analog stick for movement. We'll get back to this game in the next video. It's so interesting to me that barely any footage of this game exists, despite it being one of the 2 playable demos, but I guess it just got completely overshadowed by the Mario 64 demo at the time. The rest of what was shown at this event remained in pre-recorded video clips and screenshots, but despite not being playable, you can still find a few intriguing differences here or there. Mario Kart 64 was strangely titled Super Mario Kart R. This game appears almost complete despite not having a playable demo, and only 2 major changes are noticeable. Magic Koopa was originally a playable character before being swapped out for Donkey Kong, and the feather power-up from Super Mario Kart still remained in the game. Fun fact, you can actually still see that feather power-up on the back of the box for the Nintendo 64 system once it released. One of the most drastic alterations can be found in the Legend of Zelda demo. At this stage, it almost seems like Nintendo hadn't even started programming levels, but instead threw together a quick cutscene to let buyers know that a Zelda is on the way. This is a constantly recurring theme, and we'll get back to that in Space World 2000. In the demo, Link has a design that more closely matches most of the original games, with brown hair. It's funny because while this is technically the original Link, I just can't see brown-haired Link anymore without thinking of,
well, excuse me, princess.
This short cutscene had a heavy focus on swordplay and combat, showing a combination of parries, kicks, and of course, the classic spin attack. It wouldn't be until 1996 that we'd see a fully functional version of what the new 64-bit Zelda title would be like. Wave Race, while brief, looked like it was originally a futuristic vehicle racer, both as a planned successor to the Super Nintendo's F-Zero, and perhaps a direct planned competitor to PlayStation's 1995 Wipeout. Wave Race 64 would eventually become a human-based racer with heavy emphasis on water physics, but it's likely that they took the original core of this 1995 Wave Race when making the Nintendo 64's F-Zero title. Rare's Blast Dozer, which would eventually release in the West as Blast Core, looked fairly similar, although this crazy scorpion transformation that you see in the trailer would eventually be cut from the game. Rest in peace, Crazy Scorpion. And speaking of Rare, their classic GoldenEye was at this point planned to be an on-rail shooter similar to Virtua Cop. The footage is short, but you can tell that this game is far from the free-moving first-person shooter that it would become. There were a few other titles on display, like Pilot Wings, Star Fox, and a car game called Buggy Boogie that was eventually cancelled, but most of everything else remained pretty unchanged from what we would get closer to launch. Despite Nintendo seeming to be at least a full year behind its major competitors, many of the press websites that covered this 1995 event seem to have an enormous amount of confidence in Nintendo, especially after getting time with Super Mario 64. While the PlayStation and Saturn had already released at this point, 3D console gaming was still very much in its infancy, and many were holding back until 1996 to see what Nintendo's cheaper console had to offer before buying one. If anything though, it sure is bizarre to see how many of the core Nintendo 64 titles changed when compared to their day one reveals. We'll pick up with more history on the Nintendo 64 with next week's video in part 2 of this 3-part series. The Nintendo 64's launch came with a lot of highs and lows, both of which I think reveal themselves very well when looking at the next 1996 Space World show. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this little look into this piece of Nintendo history. I want to take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Loot Anime, for helping support the show. From the makers of Loot Crate, Loot Anime is a themed box of anime collectibles and exclusives. Here's an example of one of the past Loot Anime crates, and the new Equip-themed crate is up next. Guaranteed to have at least one exclusive shirt and 3 exclusive items from Kill la Kill, Dragon Ball Z, and Akame ga Kill. These crates sell out fast, so if you're interested in this month's theme, or you want to check out other Loot Crate products in the future, you can sign up with our code at lootcrate.com/jwits, or by clicking the link in the description to get 10% off your order. Thanks for checking out today's sponsor, and I hope you enjoy your new equipment. As always, if you enjoyed this video, consider clicking the subscribe button to follow up and get alerts when part 2 and 3 of this series are released. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time with more Nintendo content.